It is terse, it is compact. Its dynamic energy is concentrated into a mere 9.5 minutes of music, the shortest opening movement of Beethoven's 9 symphonies. And it's all the more stunning because of the bold, unprecedented way in which it begins. Known to practically every living being on Earth, it's that powerful. And the attempts to describe and explain this or that aspect of this music are endless. For instance, is there any dramatic significance to the opening motive, beyond its musical and structural function? In Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, I do believe there is an abstract parallel to the gradual process of creation in its introduction. But here in the Fifth Symphony, the basic elemental opening motive is presented right off the bat in its stark, imposing grandeur, and things proceed from there. Beethoven was already sketching his ideas for the Fifth Symphony in 1804, in tandem with the monumental Third, the Heroic Symphony. And certainly the Fifth contains the same sort of revolutionary musical outlook and language as the Eroica. And the Fifth Symphony's main key of C minor definitely evoked powerful creative impulses from the composer, as we saw in the second movement, Funeral March of the Eroica. But I don't know that there's much point in doing any more detective work here. It's all been done by others. Beethoven's iconic opening motive, the group of 4 unison notes, is not something that he necessarily invented for this symphony. Beethoven used this same basic motive for the first movement of his great Fourth Piano Concerto, which also appears in the same sketchbooks with the Fifth Symphony, the same 4-note pattern. Sounding much different. Yes? Mozart used the same motive 20 years earlier in the first movement of his equally great C major Piano Concerto number 25. In fact, there's nothing that unusual or profound about this motive itself. It's actually very unremarkable. It's how Beethoven used it. Recently, the theory has been floated that Beethoven was inspired by a post-revolutionary work by Luigi Cherubini, who was part of that big public oratory movement in Paris, his Hymn au Panthéon of 1794. And this type of work, as we've seen, definitely influenced Beethoven's heroic style. The passage in question in Cherubini's work is very brief. The men's chorus quickly exchanges a similar 4-note motive, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, sung to the words, Nous jurons tous le faire en main. We all swear with sword in hand. And here it is. So there's the big motive. Here's the passage again. Now, Beethoven admired Cherubini's music, and it's very possible that he knew this work and was influenced by this brief passage and its rhythmic motive. If I were really interested in doing some imaginative detective work, I might cite the resemblance of this basic sequence to this opening motive from the introduction to Beethoven's Fourth. Which we know so well from the Fourth Symphony. But I'm not going to go there. One can always find similarities of this sort in any composer's music, if that's how one wishes to spend one's time. The fact is that Beethoven's bold, arresting 4-note motive is a power-packed introductory gesture played in unison and octaves. This motive becomes the single unifying building block on which this first movement's architecture is based. So let's examine now in detail the amazing exposition of Beethoven's masterpiece. After announcing the first movement's main building block, which is both melodic and rhythmic, da-da-da-da, Beethoven immediately surrounds us with quick repetitions of the motive, darting about between the various string sections. And the brilliance here extends to the orchestration and its voicing. Each group of the 4 notes is played by a different section of the strings in rapid succession. First, it's the second violins. then the violas, then the first violins. And this is technically very difficult to coordinate with 40 string players in an orchestra. It must have been impossible to figure out at the 1808 premiere. But the concept, the imagination of this pointillistic writing is astounding. The physical dimension of the sound, almost as if we are surrounded on all sides by the motive. But let's back up. The main motive itself, it's 4 notes, and the first 3 short notes are all the same pitch, right? And the 4th note, the long one, is a 3rd lower, an E flat. Then in a parallel sequence, the next 3 quick notes are Fs, and the 4th, the long one, is D. And this is all the tonality Beethoven gives us. It's all unison and octaves. There's no harmony anywhere. And you recall how, in our episode on harmony, how our perception of isolated notes changes depending on its context. So what key or tonality are we in here? Maybe it's the key of E flat major. It could be, because then the F and D would do this. Well, we know, of course, that it's not E flat major, it's C minor, both of which contain these pitches. But audiences hearing this opening passage didn't know. It's too disorienting, which is part of the power of this opening. So now, as the music continues, we quickly grasp not only the tonality of C minor, but the music's rhythm and its phrase structure as well. And I suppose that sounds like a symphonic allegro once your mind starts to acclimate to what the man is doing. Actually, Beethoven's harmonic structure is rather simple. C minor, G, the dominant, then they alternate. And cadencing here on an isolated G, the dominant of C minor, which allows us to quickly get our bearings before Beethoven hurtles ahead. The motive repeats in a big unison, now clearly suggesting the key of F minor. And the scoring is now heavier and more powerful than the opening, which is odd, as is the tendency of this first movement to veer harmonically to the key of F minor. As we know, the harmonic axis of tonal music is the tonic-dominant relationship. In C minor, that would be the tonic, and G is the dominant. But Beethoven emphasized F minor, which we refer to as the subdominant of C minor, which we'll talk about in another symphony. But this lends a certain darkness and sense of gravitas, as they say, to the music. C minor, F minor, C minor, F minor, etc. Very somber in character. Anyway, Beethoven's brilliance really takes over now as he begins to grow new themes and melodic patterns from the tiny 4-note cell, which begins to change. A descending third, here's another third, prominent thirds, but it changes to accommodate the shape of the expanding melody. Here's a 4th, here's a mournful minor second. Then Beethoven chains together a series of these seconds to grow the melody, leading to our big cadence, ending on G, and then the unexpected F minor. But now the mysterious murmuring continues from top to bottom of the string section. The first violins, second violins, violas, cello and bass. This outlines this chord, a G dominant 7th chord, with the flatted note on top. We saw a lot of this in the 4th symphony. This passage takes the concept of symphonic writing to a whole new level as the music continues to evolve into a major symphonic exposition. Now the interval is a 4th. Now it's a 3rd. The shape of the motive is whatever it needs to be, as long as the basic elemental rhythm bop, 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 continues to propel the music. And now a series of suspensions like so. And you remember in Haydn's Symphony 102 how he used the normally expressive appoggiaturas to energize the music. Here, well, Beethoven uses this same appoggiatura, this suspension though. The appoggiatura leans on the main note. It's very expressive. And if you slow the music way down, there's your appoggiatura that suspends. Another one. And another one as it ascends. Another. But instead, Beethoven uses this sequence to drive the music ahead into the first thunderous passage of the work, straight C minor, driven by the repeated motive in the strings. And that tempestuous sounding chord is none other than our diminished seventh chord, guaranteed to increase the tension level in any dramatic music. And these diminished seventh chords can be pretty tricky. They can resolve in a number of ways harmonically, as we will see. In this case, this chord resolves like so. And we find ourselves in the heroic key of E flat major, and Beethoven wisely assigns this rousing passage to the French horns, and the effect is stunning. What's more, the motive has changed again. The interval is now a descending fifth, and there are two new notes added. These. So we now have three short notes and three long notes. We will call this the horn version of the motive. And even though our heads may be spinning with everything that Beethoven has done up to this point, he's still following the traditional sonata form of the classical era. And we've now arrived in the new key for the secondary material. And here the contrast in key is very effective, since Beethoven has moved to what we call the relative major key of C minor. You just slip up the C minor scale a few steps, and you arrive in E flat major. It's called the relative major because both C minor and E flat major have three flats in the key signature. I used to play in three flats. I got thrown out of all of them. Anyway, so we're now in E flat major, and the lovely lilting grace of this secondary theme could not be more welcome. And you heard how Beethoven uses sequences to extend the melody. But did you also notice what was happening in the cellos and basses? This. There it is, the omnipresent four notes now serving as the bass line, and maintaining just a hint of the music's tension. Again, this is real symphonic writing, and that underlying tension now leads to a new extension of the lyrical theme. And as it repeats, two things happen to ramp up the intensity. Harmonically, what else? A few diminished seventh chords. And our powerhouse motive in the bass. But as I said, those diminished seventh chords can lead anywhere. And here they take us out of the gloom, back to our heroic E flat major. And pow! The main motive has now become a dance. The long note isn't there. It's a continuous stream now of short notes in a new melodic version with appoggiaturas on the strong beats. And the riotous energy takes over. And a chugging bass line. And just as the first big climax had thundered out the main motive in C minor, the same thing happens here, but now in the joyous key of E flat major to conclude the exposition with full, emphatic repetitions of the motive. Here is the whole passage. And the emotional journey of this music, from the stark, ominous, shadowy, to unbridled, life-affirming joy in less than 90 seconds, is something that no other composer would ever have attempted, much less accomplished. So now you have some basic idea of how Beethoven created this awesome exposition. And here it is. And now the main motive in the horns, now with clarinets added, announces another major signpost of the music. The central development section is about to begin. And without getting technical, the stark harmonic outline of this unison passage prepares us to move into the key of F minor, that auxiliary tonal area that seems to hover over this music. And this development begins, like the exposition, softly, with the motive darting about, the second violins, the clarinet, first violins, cellos, and viola. And now a continuous stream of the motive's rapid eighth notes. I'll play it slowly. So ghostly, this continuous chaining together of these short notes. There's a gray quality to this, like all those old German paintings of the era, forests at seashore, that misty, slightly creepy feeling. And the motive is growing. It's everywhere. And you heard the tempest raging in those diminished seventh chords. Then another, which leads us to this. The rhythm sort of fractures. And three short and three long notes. That's the horn version of the theme now coming back. And Beethoven now begins to break down the motive. We're in F minor. Using just these two long notes from the theme, antiphonally, back and forth between the strings and the winds. And despite the fact that we feel the energy, the pulse of this music continually moving ahead, there's an eerie calm to this passage, a mystical aura, as if nature is contracting and devolving. The harmonies here have almost a liturgical sort of austerity to them. That mystical, austere quality has been swept away by the thunderous return of the main motive in full force with trumpets and timpani and ushered in by F minor. And And this rather brief and concentrated development section has led to the recapitulation, which, as we know, essentially restates the exposition. However, when we get to that first big cadence, with the long-held G in the violins, Beethoven now does something very unusual. He inserts a brief cadenza for the oboe that picks up on the note G. Which at this point in the movement structure gives us an unexpected moment of reflection before the drama continues to play out, which it does, following the events of the exposition until we get to that big diminished chord outburst. Remember, as I said, these diminished chords can resolve in any number of ways. In the exposition, the chord did this, and we had the horns enter. But now, in the recap, in the very same passage, the very same diminished seventh chord does this. Oh, before it did this, now it does. It works both ways. And Beethoven has used this chord now to move into C major, with the two bassoons now taking over the horn version of the theme. And so the secondary theme appears, and having moved into C major, which is referred to as the parallel major key of C minor. Here's C minor, here's C major. The secondary theme again provides a welcome respite from all of the Sturm und Drang. As the recapitulation concludes, the cadence in C major provides the perfect harmonic transition into, once again, F minor. F minor, again, clearly functioning as an important harmonic force as it signals the beginning of each major section in this movement. Now it's the coda, which is as long and involved as any of the other standard sections. And the main motive hammers away at the chord of D flat major. After a brief silence, a massive diminished seventh chord. Then what sounds like a fateful summons. And the violin's intensity, the vehemence, the wailing, torrent of eighth notes from the main motive, which hurtles precipitously into the depths. Hear how magnificently the man continues to transform and its driving energy. You just heard the arrival of a new variation. He takes the descending third interval, it now becomes this, then rising, linked together and continually rising. And at its high point, now legato, very smoothly, it begins to fall. Catches itself on these two chords, F minor and C minor, and the wailing in the violins, jolted back into rhythm with. And what what's so stirring and striking is that this does not seem at all like a traditional coda with a distinct starting point. The music is so organic and dramatic, and the way the motive changes and expands and drives the music, that we are totally swept away by the intensity and inevitability of the music as it powers through to its conclusion. Here now is the entire first movement coda. To put this in some sort of perspective, we've explored Haydn's technique of motivic construction, which he so brilliantly employed in the first movement of his Symphony No. 102, and it's obvious that Beethoven was influenced by it. But now, with the opening movement of his Fifth Symphony, Beethoven has taken this technique to an entirely new level. Another important element of symphonic architecture is the harmonic or key relations between the individual movements. And Beethoven's second movement is in the key of A flat major, which is definitely in the tonal realm of C minor. C minor, A flat major. In fact, these two notes, C and E flat, are common to both keys and triads. C minor, A flat. So there's an organic continuity between the first and second movements. Also fascinating are the subtle implications of certain keys for composers. Certain tonalities seem to evoke certain character in their music. And Beethoven's music in A flat major during this time tends to be very melodic, relaxed, and genial. The andante of his Pathétique sonata for piano, for example, this familiar music, which, like the Fifth Symphony's second movement, also follows a tempestuous C minor first movement. Then there's Beethoven's Opus 26 piano sonata in A flat, which begins not with an energetic allegro, but with a surprisingly laid-back theme and variations on this theme. And now in the Fifth Symphony, we have one of Beethoven's most unusual symphonic movements, also in A flat major, with a unique structure and a rather misleading tone to it, for lack of a better word. This is the spot for the traditional slow movement in a symphony, and in fact we often hear this second movement played much slower than Beethoven marked it, as if to force it to be something it's not. And that's part of its unique quality, that after the tempest of the first movement, Beethoven now writes what is essentially an intermezzo, beginning with a lyrical and rather breezy main theme marked andante con moto, or moving ahead and with motion, which clearly tells us that this is not ponderous music. So there's the main theme of the second movement. And like the A-flat piano sonata that I played, this second movement is also a theme and variations. It's also in a flowing triple meter, that is 3/8 notes to a bar, and they both include a florid variation of the theme. In the sonata, we have this. and both include a minor key variation. Again, in the sonata, and these were very standard devices for variations at the time. But that's where the similarities end. Beethoven is now, in his Fifth Symphony, writing a symphonic movement, not a start and stop set of variations, but music that grows and expands and develops, and whose basis is a set of variations. And what really distinguishes this unique second movement are two elements in addition to its genial theme. First, there is a recurring sense of mystery, that sort of shadowy netherworld so prominent in the first movement. And second, the appearance, 3 times, of a majestic march in C major, totally unexpected and seemingly at odds with the rest of the material. As I say, this is a very unusual movement in context and architecture. So we first hear that lovely cello theme, which begins with the 3 notes of an A-flat major triad. And this theme is based entirely on what we call a dotted rhythm. Dum, ba-bum, ba-bum. Technically, you put a dot on one of the 2 notes, and it makes it a little longer, and that makes the second note a little shorter, and it gives the tune a certain lilt or swagger. And for all its loveliness, this theme is remarkably bare. It's just the melody in unison, violas and cello, with only a solitary pizzicato bass line underneath. But together, the shape of the melody and the bass gives us enough that we can sort of fill in the harmonies on our own. Here's C major. And the theme ends with this same dotted rhythm on an A-flat triad, which is odd since it almost introduces a slight military fanfare element into this gentle music. And this cadence is now repeated twice, first by the full string section, and then, like a gentle echo, repeated by the woodwinds, which then continue like so, very gently, with a little cadence. And the strings respond now with a variation of this woodwind phrase, complete with the same cadence. It's like, okay, who's going to get the final word here with this cadence? Woodwinds or strings? But they end together. And thus ends the first theme. Immediately, the second theme appears in the clarinets and bassoons, also very genial and elegant, and also beginning with that dotted rhythm figure. With a gentle viola accompaniment under it. And there's definitely an old world promenade character to this theme. It's very courtly and graceful. But this is exactly the point at which that mysterious quality first enters. The music seems to hover. But listen to where it leads. This blazing, majestic march. And I love that low C in the cellos and basses. And it emerges from the gloom, and then it fades back into it. Once again, Beethoven is so far beyond the normal realm of musical expression in this second movement, which is totally overshadowed by the rest of the symphony. So let's briefly review what just happened with this gentle promenade second theme. And And that dotted rhythmic figure that started it suddenly gets us off track into the mist, recalling the first movement. And no surprise, it's a diminished seventh chord that makes all of this possible. But the entire orchestra now enters with this same chord, except that the lowest note is altered from A down to A flat, which also alters the function of the chord. In fact, it now sounds exactly like our standard dominant seventh chord on A flat, which should resolve like so. Curtain. But instead, Beethoven stuns us in a blaze of glory, resolving this chord like this. And the second theme, formerly so graceful, now transformed into a triumphant procession in C major, almost an antidote to all of the C minor Sturm und Drang from the first movement. But this momentary glory fades with that same dotted figure that has been so prominent. And the music slips back into diminished seventh gloom. There's the dotted rhythm upbeat, and it just hovers now in a series of disorienting harmonies that sustain this air of shadow and mystery. Very odd. There's almost a mystical quality to it. Then a sudden crescendo, and 3 octaves of E flat. E flat being the dominant, leading back to the tonic A flat. And this closes out the first major section of the movement. But this unexpected, eerie, mystical passage we've just come through is so remarkable, and it's such an important element in the overall spirit of this symphony, that we should hear it now with the orchestra. And the second major section of the movement that we now hear is almost an exact repeat of what we've heard up until this point, so it's very easy to follow. So we've had the opening lyrical theme with its slightly austere accompaniment and its closing fanfare triad. Then the woodwinds extend it, as do the strings with this. Then the second promenade theme. Its transformation into a procession in C major, followed by the hovering mystical string harmonies. So Beethoven now essentially repeats all of this to form the second major section or panel of this movement. But there are some changes, and since this is a theme and variations, the main theme is now elaborated by the violas and celli, and those isolated E flats that we heard now leave one clarinet hanging over this new florid variation. And once again, these strings extend the theme. And we come to expect this string passage after each variation. And Beethoven plays on our expectations, as he will do something very special when this passage makes its final appearance. You'll see. But for now, we hear those repeated cadences in the strings, answered an octave higher by the woodwinds, and then all together. This all seems very formulaic, like there's a prerequisite number of formal bows in this courtly music, like, "After you, Professor." And oh no, I wouldn't dream of it, dear doctor. Okay, then everybody together. Let's all bow together and have done with it. We're now in Beethoven's second section, and he once again gives us his lovely promenade secondary theme. But now the viola accompaniment, which was this in the first variation, now, like the theme itself, is more active, more florid. So there's more rhythmic motion this second time through. And the strings in the big C major processional, they now play. Even in the mystical hovering chord passage, the cellos initially were just playing a single note. Now they play more active. Yes, does that sound familiar? 3 short notes? Could be. And it's so soft that it's barely audible. And when we move back to A flat major, the rhythm of those octave E flats increases mathematically, as you heard. And now the third major panel of this movement begins, with another even more florid variation of the main theme, again in the cellos and violas. And now the theme will shift to the first violins, and those woodwind octaves now become a gentle nature sound as this variation glides along. And there we heard yet another variation for full orchestra with pulsing winds and brass, and the very florid theme in the cellos and basses. And now we've clearly reached a juncture in this movement with those big scales settling on the dominant note of E flat. Okay, now we have an interlude, a new variation which starts very softly on the E flat dominant chord in the strings. And the theme is now in the clarinet, but based on the dominant harmony. Now the bassoon enters on the tonic chord. And Beethoven takes the basic outline of the theme, and he creates this little fantasy for the flute and oboe in thirds. And the 2 clarinets an octave lower, also playing in thirds, but in a mirror or opposite motion of the flute and oboes, as you will hear, producing these lovely harmonies. And there, without warning, our secondary theme returned, the grand C major procession with these harmonies. And the horns taking over with the dominant note G. And there it is, C major. Now we have a brief interlude based on the ascending triad figure, which becomes this. having a new triplet rhythm, which merges into quicker 30-second notes. This is Beethoven doing his motivic organic thing, spinning out a tiny motive to become something new. In this case, it's an accompaniment for a new variation in the minor key. This is certainly nowhere near as complex a variation technique as we would see years later in the Dvorak symphonic variations we looked at, or the Brahms-Haydn variations, or for that matter in Beethoven's own Ninth Symphony. Still, this music is so tightly organized. Every thematic entity begins with some form of the ascending triad. The opening theme, the secondary theme, which becomes the C major procession, later the surging string figures, even the oft-repeated string extension. There's your ascending triad. And the main theme ends with the triad, sounding like a fanfare. It's everywhere, and it's an important part of the symphonic unity of this music. And speaking of motivic unity, there is definitely a resemblance, conscious or not, between the first movements, 3 short and 1 long notes, and this, of this movement. And you'll see it again in the scherzo. But now there is a final variation in the second movement, suddenly at a quicker tempo and rather whimsical, with this string accompaniment. And the bassoon plays the theme with a new harmonic twist, following with the triad and an A-flat dominant 7th chord. Yes? And then this diminished harmony. Here is this interlude. And when we encounter the final appearance of that string extension, that passage we've heard so often, which descends like so, right? I mentioned that Beethoven does something very special the last time. We've always heard, but the final time he changes it to this. That lovely expressive arch of the melody from this to this. It's as if near the end of the movement, Beethoven dismisses the standard issue version, the formality of this tune, and instead allows it to blossom. Now it's sunny, it's warm, it's very human, and it leads to a tranquil and pastoral vision, at least until the triad begins to rise from the depths and takes over entirely. And this very unusual movement, whose unique qualities are overshadowed by everything that surrounds it in this symphony, ends triumphantly And it's that second theme that is so fascinating in the way it functions in Beethoven's musical and architectural plan. It begins as a companion to the main theme, with which it shares its opening rhythm. It's so graceful and elegant, but it's continually drifting into that remote world of the first movement, before bursting forth in glorious C major, and that low C in the cellos and basses. And this procession offers us a clear preview of our ultimate destination in the symphony's finale. Why is this theme, at first so graceful, then bold and triumphant, why is it continually slipping in and out of this shadowy realm of Beethoven's creative world? Well, we're about to slip back into it for Beethoven's most awesome scherzo to date, where we are reminded that his visionary powers extended to his use of the orchestra, in this case the low string section. There isn't a serious orchestra in the world today, more than 200 years later, that doesn't require cellists to play the second movement as part of their audition, or for the double basses to play this scherzo. Beethoven required the low string instruments to expand their traditional limited role in the orchestra beyond what any players at the time were expected or able to do. But his imagination, years ahead of its time, would not allow him to do any less. And the scherzo's main theme is heard throughout, played solely, meaning that as a solo group of instruments, by the cellos and basses. It's an astounding effect as they rise from the depths of the orchestra. A shadowy, eerie sound that connects once again with the somber, misty elements in the first and second movements. And that opening phrase is essentially a C minor triad. Until this. It's completed then by the violins and the winds, and cadences gently on the dominant G, but it's hushed and almost resigned, as the boldness of the first movement comes charging through now with the French horns and a new theme. Or is it? It's 3 short notes and 1 long, but they're all the same pitch. It's not that. It is this. A powerful, stern march, the melody all on G, but the harmonies alternating tonic and dominant. And when the unison horns divide into thirds, at that very moment the bass descends to A flat. So we get this briefly. Appoggiatura, I love it. Moving now into E flat minor, which is a third higher than what we just heard, doubling the intensity. Beethoven now extends the march with this. These heavy accents, now it fades, leaving us in B flat minor, a full step lower than the opening C minor, and a reappearance now of the ghostly cello bass theme. And we proceed as before, but in B flat minor. And I have to stop for a moment now because this passage signals another major advance by Beethoven in symphonic writing. We know that the symphonic scherzo, like its forerunner, the minuet, is structured in 3 basic parts. Scherzo, a central trio section, scherzo repeated. And we've also seen that the main scherzo, the first third, is itself in 2 parts. In Beethoven's 4th Symphony, this is the first part. It's 20 measures long, and it ends with then it all repeats. Literally. Then we go on to the second part, which is longer than the first part. It's more involved, but it ends like so. And this second part is also repeated before we go on to the central trio. And this was absolutely the norm in symphonic architecture, that both sections of the opening scherzo were repeated verbatim, note for note. The composer merely wrote in the repeat sign in the music to indicate that the orchestra play both sections twice. It was an essential part of the balance and proportion of the scherzo form. And here in the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven will honor this tradition, sort of, because he's at a point in his own development that maybe this literal repeat thing is too limiting, too formulaic. It doesn't allow him to expand the scherzo like the other movements. So at this point that we left the scherzo, we had moved into the lower key of B flat minor. And now what would normally be a literal repeat of the scherzo from the beginning in C minor now stays in B flat minor. Very mysterious. Then it will shift back to C minor, the main key. Like so on the dominant G. And Beethoven takes this, he lowers it to this, and he uses it to expand as it climbs and the volume increases. The march returns, and it moves now to the key of F minor. That secondary tonality from the first movement, making all of this higher and more intense. Again, the march fades, and Beethoven then takes the second phrase of the main theme, which is this, and he uses it to extend the scherzo. And this eerie gliding effect of this passage suddenly locks into a more distinct, dance-like rhythm. And over it, the first violins lead with this. And this builds, including a few measures of this, which seem to recall the rhythm of three short notes. Well, maybe not. Then a final fortissimo statement of the horn march, and the main scherzo ends. This is a lot of detail, I know, but Beethoven pushed himself to compose all of this new material instead of taking the easy way out and simply repeating the second section of the scherzo. So here is the entire scherzo up to the trio section, and I'll call it out as it occurs, and it will all fall into place. The cello and bass rise. Here is the second phrase. The cello and bass again, extended slightly. And the horn march. It repeats in E flat minor. And it fades, but instead of repeating from the top, we stay in B flat minor for the repeat. And we wind our way back chromatically to the dominant G. And the march returns in C minor. Now it repeats in F minor. And once again, it fades, and it's now extended using the second phrase. Now it locks into dance rhythm. And the rapid four-note motive. And a powerful closing. And so, musical history has been made again. And now the trio, always lighter and more relaxed in nature. But not this time. Again, the cello and the basses are in the spotlight with another future audition excerpt. A dance-like trio that is boisterous, good-natured, it's in C major, and it's structured like a fugue. And this rugged new theme is built on rapid eighth notes. And this jolly sequence. And the violas and bassoons then enter in the dominant key of G. Exactly in the Baroque style. And this section will end with this. Sounds familiar, yes. Maybe. Now, this trio does feature the traditional repeats, but even so, Beethoven continues to think in terms of continual development of his materials. So now the second section of the trio begins rather humorously with two false starts in the style of Haydn. They just stop, but the third time is the charm, and Beethoven uses this figure to extend the theme like so. And this robust trio theme gradually lightens and it ascends into the heights. And the woodwinds, in a seamless chain of G dominant seventh chord, descend back into the depths with an ominous A flat taken up by the cellian bass. And the scherzo returns. So now, before we continue, I have two sidebars which I would like to share with you. You may want to hit pause and grab a beer. First, regarding Beethoven's four-note motive that powers the first movement, it seems that some form of this motive, or its distinctive rhythm, is present in the other three movements. The second movement's processional, the scherzo's horn march, the trio, and we'll meet this rhythm again in the finale. Some people say that this similarity is significant and intentional, like Beethoven was leaving us little clues, a trail of breadcrumbs for us to discover centuries later. Some say that these similarities are not that special, that Beethoven did this sort of thing all the time. As I mentioned earlier, the Fourth Piano Concerto's first movement is built on the same rhythm. And in the same sketchbook that contains the Fourth Concerto and the Fifth Symphony, we also find what would become Beethoven's Opus 68. Impressions of the Countryside. And again, the theme starts with the same rhythm. Bum, three shorter notes. The same motive. But whether Beethoven planned or calculated any of this is not that important. But his widespread use of this motive is evidence of the way he thought, how he conceived music, that life force within him, how it manifested itself in the astounding range of musical expression that he could derive from the slightest, most insignificant rhythmic fragment. Da-da-da-da. It's astounding. The other sidebar involves the first performance of the Fifth Symphony. One would imagine, or hope, that the premier performances of Beethoven's new works would have been greatly anticipated and supported in Vienna. And even though his aristocratic patrons continued to support him financially, Beethoven still had to fight it out with the petty bureaucrats and the authorities in order to schedule a major concert in a large public theater. And as usual, Beethoven also had to act as his own producer in organizing one of these Academy concerts. And since they occurred only once every few years, there was plenty of new music to present to the public. Beethoven was finally granted the use of the popular Theater an der Wien for the evening of Thursday, December 22nd, 1808, 3 days before Christmas, when the theater was unoccupied and unheated. And that's as much as they would give him. Beethoven also organized the orchestra and the chorus, which he conducted. He was a notoriously erratic conductor. The music was all brand new. The player's music was freshly copied and filled with mistakes, and there was approximately 4 hours playing time of music to be rehearsed in a very short time. Believe me, this is a recipe for disaster, especially with an audience sitting in a dark, freezing theater. You may know Beethoven's delightful one-of-a-kind work, his Opus 80 Choral Fantasy. It begins as a lengthy improvisation for solo piano. Then it becomes a set of variations for piano and orchestra, and it culminates in a grand finale complete with 6 vocal soloists and full chorus. I love this piece. It is just so terrific. Well, it was composed especially as the grand finale to this concert, which explains its oddness in design and its performing forces. So this mammoth concert began at 6:30 p.m., and it included, first, an aria for soprano and orchestra, A Perfido, 3 movements from the lovely Mass in C major with soloists and chorus, a lengthy solo piano improvisation by Mr. Beethoven, the brand new choral fantasy for all the performing forces as a finale. Now, wouldn't that be enough for one evening in a cold theater? Well, the concert also included the world premiere performances of Beethoven's 5th Symphony, his 6th Symphony, the Pastoral, and the 4th Piano Concerto with the composer as soloist, all on the same program. And somehow, it all happened. It is almost impossible to imagine what the audience experienced that night. The surviving eyewitness accounts were as supportive as they could be, but the magnitude, the historical significance of that legendary night cannot be overestimated. And as massive a pain in the neck as it was for everyone to sit through this thing, what would any of us give to go back in time and freeze along with that audience and hear what took place on the evening of December 22nd, 1808. Now, back to the scherzo. The rambunctious trio has disintegrated, and we slide back into the shadowy, mysterious return of the scherzo. However, Beethoven continues to innovate now. He continues to write musical history in the form of this 5th Symphony, because instead of a literal repeat of the scherzo from the top after the trio, Beethoven now reimagines all of it. And in doing so, he creates a totally creepy skeletal version of it. The powerful horn march now becomes this. It's spectral. Did you hear those fleeting, wispy sounds in the violins and violas? Very difficult to execute, especially for a full section of players. And it's impossible to overestimate the effect this passage would have on German Romanticism of the era, especially the rise of Gothic supernatural literature, poetry, opera, and the overwrought imagination of French composer Hector Berlioz, whose Symphonie Fantastique would rely heavily on this music for inspiration. And Beethoven's novel extension of the scherzo, which we heard before the trio, is now reduced to a mere outline, a desolate landscape of pizzicato strings and haunting nature sounds from the woodwinds. And now we encounter what many consider to be Beethoven's absolute masterstroke of innovation in this symphony. Not long after Beethoven's death, Hector Berlioz described this upcoming passage and its effect on an audience in Paris. He said, quote, "At that moment when the orchestra seems to be taking us from a subterranean cave to a temple of the sun, the shouts of acclamation, the cries of hush, shh, the clapping, the convulsive laughter exploded with such force that the orchestra was buried beneath the torrent of enthusiasm and disappeared completely. The entire audience was seized by a spasm of nervous excitement, and not till it subsided were the players able to be heard. And here's what he was describing. Beethoven's signature rhythmic motive is dying away in a pathetic whimper in the bassoon. It's now taken up by the timpani on the note C, the tonic note. As the music settles into this unearthly calm, and below, the cello and bass sustain an A flat. And talk about architecture in music. The symphonic model was 4 separate movements, each movement a complete entity unto itself, until now, as Beethoven's creative powers began to reach their height. And the ghostly scherzo gradually, organically evolves, a bridge directly into the blazing glory of the finale. And the reputation of this symphony as an embodiment of darkness to light is based primarily on this dramatic, groundbreaking transition, as the timpani softly sound the motive, and the scherzo theme begins to rise in the first violins, but minus its first and last notes, like so. And Beethoven extracts those last 3 notes, and he repeats them. The timpani now increase its pattern into continuous quarter notes on C. And the cello and bass leave their long A flat, and they begin a rhythmic pattern of their own that revolves around the note G. G. While above this, the fragment of melody in the violins also revolves around G, like so. G. So they're both, the cello and bass down below and the violins above are both involved in a figure here that is rotating, that is circulating around the note G, like so. And it interlocks rhythmically. Let me play it slowly. For this very brief moment, Beethoven has captured something of the profound nature of music as it exists in time and space, the physical interaction of levels of sound and their gradual alignment. And the second that the timpani and the basses lock into the same rhythmic pattern, softly, at that very moment, the first violin's fragments begin to stabilize, and they become a continuous flow now, with the intervals of the motive expanding upwards, like so. Here's a minor sixth, a major sixth, a seventh, a higher seventh, an octave, a higher octave, a higher octave, until we reach this wide open elemental chord, this amazing progression from darkness to light, often imitated, never equaled in the history of music. Here it is. The finale, a festive celebration, a hymn of triumph, and also a standard sonata form with a coda. But it includes one very unusual event right in the middle of the movement. And even though the themes of this finale all function as required by the sonata form, Their character suggests a series of fanfares, marches, even patriotic songs, all in Beethoven's heroic style of the period, exactly what is needed after the intense drama of the preceding movements. There are 4 themes in this exposition, so here they are. The main theme, which is in 3 parts. The first part is this. Built on a straight C major triad. Its second part is a dashing, rising scale, which may or may not be related to the Scherzo's trio theme. I don't know, maybe. And third, an exuberant phrase built on a rising sixth, which has a definite folk-like character. Then there is a transition in unison and octaves, and it's built on a rhythmic unit of 4 rapid notes. 4 notes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Sound familiar? And this leads to the second main theme, still in C major, which might as well have had patriotic lyrics written to it, which Beethoven then extends. And another transition now, which also uses a 4-note motive, which modulates to the dominant key of G major, where we encounter our third theme, which is also built on a basic unit of 4 notes. Okay, that was slower than it should be. Another transition then, and we have our 4th and final theme of the exposition. It's also in G major, and it will serve as the slightly more lyrical theme here, and it's scored more lightly than anything that we've heard thus far. And it's actually quite expressive. And it cadences in an almost Mozartian way. And this 4th theme is the most lyrical, but there's also an intensity in these accented chromatic notes. And this theme is repeated then forte by the entire orchestra. That's a quick rundown of the exposition's 4 principal themes. 2 in C major, 2 in G major. Here now is the exposition, and I'll call them out as we go. The first theme. And its second part. And its third part, the folk-like motive. And it's now extended. And here is the 4-note transition figure. And the second theme, like a patriotic song. Now it's extended. And its 4-note motive as a transition. And the third theme, and its bass line, which will later become the melody. The bass line. And all of this based on the 4-note motive. And our 4th theme, the somewhat lyrical and chromatic one. And a little Mozartian cadence. Repeated now by the full orchestra. And moving to F minor. And we have almost arrived now at the central development section, but I should mention another important fact about this symphony. To increase the impact of this finale, Beethoven augments the orchestra by adding a piccolo to the top of the woodwind choir, a contrabassoon to increase the weight at the bottom, and, most tellingly, 3 trombones in the brass section, which add sonority and breadth to the overall effect. They were used in opera and church music, but rarely in concert, and never all 5 of them in one work. And as we move into the development section now, Beethoven focuses on the 3rd theme, the one that had a vigorous 4-note motive to it, like so. And its gentle 2nd phrase, which features this bass line, which you barely noticed. You add the melody over it, and it's this. Seemingly insignificant, this bass line, until Beethoven begins to promote the bass line to melodic status. We then hear it forcefully in the cellian bass and contrabassoon, until it emerges as a theme on its own in the trombones and bassoons. And the 4-note motive is scurrying around. Then Beethoven breaks it down into just its first 2 notes. We've been hearing, but now he breaks it down like so. Which leads to a truly thrilling moment with this new theme, which had been the bass line, now as a triumphant chorale in the woodwinds, to which the brass add, and the violins are dashing around with the rapid 4-note motive that had been the melody. And this is Beethoven's brilliant new approach to symphonic writing at work. He takes the 3rd theme, which was, and its bass line. He takes it all apart and he reassembles or reassigns these things to grow a new episode in his development section. There is also a report that suggests that Beethoven was using another well-known revolutionary song at this point in the finale, a song composed by Claude Rouget de Lille, the man who wrote La Merced. I'm not sure. I have a difficult time finding that motive here. But there's something very significant perhaps going on in a programmatic, symbolic way when Beethoven takes the formerly lowly bass line, yes, the lowly bass line that functions down here, and the sort of flighty, dashing upper part, and he exchanges them. Now the lowly, the lower class is perhaps now elevated to the upper class and takes prominence, while the formerly flighty, dashing voice is now assigned a subsidiary role. I don't know. I said I'm not going to go looking for obscure things here, but it's very, very interesting the way Beethoven takes this melody and its bass line and switches their roles. And since groundbreaking events seem to occur at regular intervals in this work, we're headed for another one now. Let's back up to that great passage we just looked at, with the 3rd theme and its bass line repurposed, but we're headed into a grand climax in the dominant key of G. And it's a big one, but listen where it goes. That unexpected series of repeated G's in the violins. Very interesting way to end this imposing passage. Yes? And these repeated G's lead to this. A shadowy recall of the scherzo, the 3rd movement, right in the middle of the finale. Maybe not quite as revolutionary as it seems, since we saw in our minuet episode how Haydn did this same thing in his Symphony No. 46. from 1775. Incidentally, I mistakenly said it predated Beethoven's Fifth by 50 years, when it was actually more like 35 years. Still, it's impossible to know if Beethoven was aware of Haydn's number 46. Certainly the general public had never heard of such a thing, the third movement reappearing in the middle of the finale. So Beethoven now uses this opportunity to rewrite his scherzo to suit his architectural plan. He locks into the four-note motif, recalling the horn march, and he uses it to gradually build his way out of the scherzo, back into the finale. The clarinets, violas, and horns repeat the motif in G major, the dominant chord, while above the flute, oboe, and bassoon outlined a dominant seventh chord, that is G major, with an F added on top. So we get this. Under which the timpani enter sort of prematurely on the note C, the tonic note, like so, anticipating the resolution of the dominant G to C. And so we get a condensed version of that brilliant transition to the finale that we heard before, the one that Berlioz said drove the audience nuts, which now leads to the finale's recapitulation. So structurally, the recall of the scherzo functions beautifully as an episode in Beethoven's central development section. And now the four themes all reappear as before, except, as we know, in sonata form, everything in the recap stays in the tonic key of C major. But once we get to that point where the exposition ended, Beethoven now reaches back to devise a novel way to conclude this monumental symphony. Here's how he does it. Coming out of his fourth theme, this one, and the intensity builds through these harmonies, diminished seventh chords in the full orchestra, but the bass moves up to F. Whoa! B flat major, B diminished, F sharp, diminished seventh to C major. And the return of that great passage with the third theme and its bass line repurposed. And Beethoven focuses, concentrates the incredible energy into those powerful, isolated chords. G, the dominant. C, the tonic. G, C, G. More on this simple tonic-dominant progression in just a minute. But the stage is now set for a new theme, played solely by the two bassoons. And the horns echo it softly. But it's not actually a new theme, even though the big setup seemed to indicate that it is. It's actually derived from the finale's second theme, the patriotic one. Yes, now transformed to. And I'd say that this newly reconstituted theme does have something of a populist feel to it. It's a simple tune built on basic triad, and its continuation, and the rolling accompaniment that's in the strings that gains momentum, with banners waving in the breeze, maybe, cascading waves of song. And we've heard this motif back in the development section. Now with the piccolo standing in for the military fife. And this charming rococo-ish cadence. Now, I have no evidence that anything that I'm saying is true. But Beethoven did write a grand funeral march in the Third Symphony, so why not a rousing, revolutionary marching tune here? And there, Beethoven repeats this new harmonic passage with B flat and A flat in the bass, like so, while breaking up the rhythm and accelerating the tempo and crescendoing all at the same time right into the coda at breakneck speed. And this runaway coda theme is none other than our formerly lyrical theme. Recognize it? That's number 4 on our hit parade countdown of revolutionary favorites, the gentle one. Yes, now Beethoven brings back the first theme, now totally joyous, dashing ahead into the most C major passage in all of music. The final 28 measures of this symphony, all C major, all the time, no doubt about it. Every possible rhythmic permutation of the C major chord from the full orchestra without a single G dominant chord anywhere in sight. Being fascinated as I am by the power and beauty of harmony, I'm automatically disinterested in, for instance, the many, many works that you often find from the early classical era with very rudimentary tonic and dominant harmonies. I'll go into D major here, this sort of thing. There's a lot of this where it's just tonic, dominant, tonic. But Beethoven, through the sheer force of his creative power, could take these same 2 chords, tonic and dominant, reducing his harmonic plan to the absolute minimum, its most primal, and along with his astounding imagination and technique, the elemental simplicity of these harmonies actually helped him to conceive, design, and construct music of titanic power and grandeur. The blinding force of the Fourth Symphony's introduction, as we saw, entirely sustained on that dominant chord. The inexorable momentum of the Eroica Symphony's first movement coda, built entirely on the tonic and dominant chords. Or in the Eroica's finale, the coda, the boundless driving energy, all built on simple repetitions of tonic and dominant chords. There's a passage in the Credo movement of Beethoven's great Mass in C major, written during the same general period as the Fifth Symphony. The passage depicting Christ's resurrection and ascension. The chorus sings unison on a rising C major triad, the Latin words, sedet ad dexteram Patris. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. Like so. It's all unison in octaves. Sedet ad dexteram And on the word Patris, Father, the chorus breaks into a full C major chord, the timpani charging ahead, the strings ascending, and then they descend. And it all happens on a single C major chord. Beethoven doesn't even need a dominant chord anywhere. The recording we have here is played on original instruments, so the pitch is a bit lower. But still, we are carried aloft by this brief and stunning passage. That's it. That's all. But that single span of music, which emerges from the darkness of the Crucifixus section and ascends into heaven, is a perfect example of the elemental power of Beethoven's art. I sang bass in a chorus of this Mass 50 years ago in April of 1970, and that one brief passage remains one of the most thrilling moments of my performing experience. And around the same time Beethoven wrote this Mass, he applied to the Imperial Court Theater in Vienna for an annual stipend in order that he might continue to compose and survive at the same time. In his petition, he assured the committee that his composing was, as he said, much less to earn his daily bread than it was to raise the taste of the public and to let his own genius, quote, soar to greater heights and even to perfection, unquote. His application was turned down. So Beethoven just soldiered on. I'm Lawrence Rapchak, and thank you for listening.